Every object you have ever studied in physics has one thing in common: a definite position, a ball, a planet, a block on a spring. You can always ask where is it right now and expect a real answer. That assumption is about to break down. This is a lecture 1 of a new series on quantum mechanics based on David Griffiths' Introduction to Quantum Mechanics, and we are starting exactly where the book does. Let's begin with what we already know: the classical mechanics. Picture a single particle, a mass m, free to slide along the x-axis, pushed around by some force f of x and t that can depend on where the particle is and on the time itself. That's the whole setup. Classical mechanics has exactly one job: figure out x of t, the position, as a function of time. And once you know x of t, everything else comes for free. Differentiate position, you get velocity v equals dx dt. Multiply velocity by mass, you get momentum p equals mv. Take the half mv squared, you get kinetic energy. Position, velocity, momentum, energy, the entire dynamical picture cascades out of that one function. So how do you actually calculate x of t? Newton's second law: force equals mass times acceleration. Acceleration is nothing but the second derivative of position, d2x over dt squared. And if the force happens to be conservative, which for most of this course it will be, we can write it as a negative derivative of potential energy. Put that into Newton's law, and the whole classical mechanics collapses into one differential equation: m times second derivative of x with respect to t equals negative partial derivative of v with respect to x. Give this equation a starting position and a starting velocity, x of 0, v of 0, right at t equals 0, and it hands you x of t forever. Past, present, future, all of it fixed by two numbers and one equation. That's a classical program, and it's the benchmark we are about to measure quantum mechanics against. Quantum mechanics asks for a completely different question. Instead of solving for x of t, we solve for something called the wave function, capital Psi, a function of position and time. We get it by solving what's called the Schrödinger equation. Let's build it piece by piece. On the left, I times h bar times partial derivative of psi with respect to time, the time evolution time, telling you how the wave function changes the moment by moment. On the right, first minus h bar squared over 2m times the second partial derivative of psi with respect to x, a curvature term that plays a very similar role to kinetic energy. Finally, plus V times psi, the potential energy. Put it together, IH bar partial psi over partial t equals minus h bar squared over 2m partial squared psi by partial x squared plus V psi. This equation is the single most important equation in this course. Two constants you will need constantly. I is just the square root of minus 1, and h bar, h with a bar through it, is just a Planck's constant, or called the reduced Planck's constant, which is just h divided by 2 pi. Here's the payoff. The Schrödinger equation plays the exactly logical role Newton's second law played a moment ago. Give it psi of x at t is equals to 0, one snapshot of the wave function, and it determines psi of x comma t for every future moment. Same structure, same power, just different unknown. So here's the obvious question: what does psi actually mean? A particle is a point, it's somewhere definite and specific, but psi is spread out over all space. So what is this function telling us? The answer comes from Max Born in 1926, and it's the strangest idea in this entire course. Psi doesn't tell you where the particle is, it tells you the probability of where the particle is. Specifically, the square of the absolute value of psi times a small interval dx that gives you the probability of finding the particle somewhere between x and x plus tx at that instant. Picture a typical wave function, its absolute value squared plotted as a curve. Here's a point A sitting under a tall peak. Here's a point B out in a shallow valley. If you go and actually measure the particle's position, you are far more likely to find it near A than near B. Not because it's hiding near A. As far as the theory is concerned, there is nothing more to say about where it really is. The wave function and only the wave function is what physics has to offer. Statistical interpretation raises an uncomfortable question. Say we measure a particle's position and we find it at a specific point, call it C. Fair enough, but here's the question that split physics for most of the 20th century. Where was the particle an instant before we measure it? There were three serious answers. The realist position, associated with Einstein, said the particle was at sea all along. It had a definite position the whole time. We simply didn't know what it was. On this view, quantum mechanics isn't wrong. Exactly, it's incomplete. There is some deeper layer of reality, hidden variables that the theory doesn't capture yet. The orthodox position, the Copenhagen interpretation, associated with Niels Bohr, says something much stranger. The particle wasn't anywhere at all, not hidden, not merely unknown. There was no fact of the matter about its position until the act of measurement forced one into existence. The agnostic position, associated with Pauli, refuses to engage with the question at all. If you can't test where the particle was before you measured it, asking is meaningless. That's philosophy, not physics. For decades, all three had serious, brilliant defenders. This looked like a question physics might never settle. Then in 1964, John Bell changed everything. He showed mathematically that these aren't just different philosophies, they make different testable predictions. If the particle really did have a definite position all along, experiments come out one way. If it didn't, they come out another way. This wasn't a matter of test anymore. It was an experiment waiting to be run. And that alone killed the agnostic position. You can't refuse to answer a question that has a measurable answer. So the experiments were run again and again and again. And every time they've sided with the orthodox view. The particle really doesn't have a definite position before you measure it. It behaves less like a tiny ball with a hidden address and more like a ripple on a pond with no fixed location until something reaches it and pins it down. Here's a natural follow-up. What if right after that first measurement we measure the position again immediately? Every interpretation agrees on the answer. You get C again and again measure it 100 times in a row right after each other and you get C every single time. Why? The orthodox explanation is that the very act of that first measurement radically altered the wave function. Before you measured, psi looked like the broad wavy curve spread out probabilities made across a wide region. The instant you measure and find the particle at C, the wave function collapses, snaps down into a sharp spike centered right on C. Measure again immediately and of course you get C again. That's where essentially all the probability now sits. But here's the catch. Left alone, that spike doesn't stay a spike. It obeys the Schrödinger equation just like anything else and spreads out over the time. So if you want to measure twice and reliably get the same answer, the second measurement has to happen fast before the spike has time to broaden again. This points to something deep. There are two completely different kinds of processes in quantum mechanics. Ordinary evolution, which is smooth, continuous, fully deterministic, governed moment to moment by Schrödinger equation, and measurement, sudden, discontinuous, generally probabilistic, where the wave function collapses. Two different rules, and we'll spend the rest of this course learning how they fit together. Because of Bound's rule, Probability isn't a side topic in quantum mechanics anymore. It's central, so before we go further, let's build the tools we need, starting about as simple as it gets, not with particles but with people. Imagine a room of 14 people. One is 14 years old, one is 15, three are 16, two are 22, and two are 24, and five are 25. We write n of j for the number of people of age j. So n of 14 is 1, n of 16 is 3, n of 25 is 5, and notice for most ages, say 17, n of j is just 0. Nobody in the room is 17 at all. Add n of j over every possible age and you get that total n equals 14. Almost too obvious to write down, but it anchors everything that follows. Now the real question. What's the probability of randomly picking a person of age j? It's n of j divided by n, the fraction of the room that age represents. The probability of picking someone who's 14 is 1 in 14. Add p of j over every single age, everywhere this could possibly turn out, and you have to get exactly 1. You are certain to get some age. It sounds trivial, but it's anchor that keeps everything else consistent. With the same room of 14 people, we can ask a few more questions, each with a precise standard answer. First, the most probable age. Just look for the tallest bar. 5 people are 25. Nobody else comes close. So the most probable age is 25. Second, the median. Line up all the 14 people by age and find the value that splits the room exactly in half. 7 younger and 7 older. And do that and you land on 23, which is little strange because look at the data. Nobody in the room is actually 23. The median doesn't have to be anybody's real age. The third and the most important, the mean. Add up every age weighted by how many people have it. 14 plus 15 plus 316 plus 222s plus 224s plus 525s. Divide by 14 and you get 294 over 14. 21. The average of j equals the sum of j times n of j over n, or equivalently sum of j times p of j, and again nobody in the room is 21 either. The average is the property of the whole distribution, not a description of any one person. In quantum mechanics, this average gets a special name, the expectation value. It is slightly misleading name. Honestly, it doesn't mean the outcome you'd mostly likely to get from any single measurement. That's the mode. The expectation value is what you'd get by averaging over an enormous number of identically prepared measurements. We can do the same trick with j squared. Average the square instead of the value and call it the average of j squared. In general, for pretty much any function f of j, the expectation value of f is just the sum of f of j times p of j, one of the most useful tools in this entire course. But here's a warning worth remembering. The average of the square is not the same as the square of the average. Take two babies, ages 1 and 3, average of the squares 1 squared plus 3 squared over 2, that's 5. Square of the average 1 plus 3 over 2 squared, that's 4. 5 doesn't equal 4. Keep those two operations straight. Mixing them up is one of the most common mistakes in this subject. Here's a problem the mean, the mode, and the median can solve. Picture two different distributions that have same mean, same median, and same mode, identical in every way we've measured so far, but one is tightly bunched and the other is spread out wide. Clearly, these are different distributions. We need a number that captures their difference, the spread. And the natural first guess is to look at how far each value deviates from the average. Define delta j as j minus the average of j. and then just average the deviation. Let's try it. Average of j minus average of j equals 0. Always exactly 0 no matter what the distribution looks like. Completely useless as a measure of spread. The fix is simple. Square the deviation before you average it. Define the variance sigma squared as the average of delta j squared. Sigma itself is the standard deviation. Let's expand this properly because the algebra gives us something genuinely useful. The average of j squared minus the average of j squared. The single most useful formula in this toolkit and exactly the quantity we warned you about in the last scene. One more thing falls right out of this. Since variance is built from average of a square, it can never be negative. Sigma square is always greater than or equal to 0, which means the average of j squared is greater than or equal to average of j squared. With equality only when sigma is 0, when there is no spread at all, every member of the distribution has exactly same value. Everything we just did assumed j was discrete, a whole number of years. Particle's position isn't like that. Position is continuous. It can be any real number at all. And that creates a real problem. What's the probability this person is exactly 16 years old? Not 16 is exactly 16 down to last decimal. Keep adding decimals and the probability of hitting that exact value shrinks towards 0 the whole time. For a genuinely continuous variable, the probability of any single exact value is exactly 0. So we stop asking about exact points and ask about intervals instead, defining a probability density, rho of x, the probability of landing somewhere between x and x plus tx is rho of x times tx. To find the probability of landing in a finite range from a to b, you integrate p sub ab equals the integral from a to b of rho of x dx, the area under the curve between those 2 points. Here's the beautiful part. Every formula we build for discrete distributions translate directly, replace every sum with an integral. Normalization, integrate rho of x dx over all space, get 1. Any function's expectation value, integrate f of x times rho of x dx, and variance keeps exactly the same form it always had. Sigma squared equals the average of x squared minus the average of x squared. Nothing new to derive. The algebra doesn't care whether you started with a sum or an integral. And here's why we just spent all this time on people's edges. This probability density rho of x is exactly the role that the absolute valued squared of wave function plays for a real quantum particle. Everything in this scene was really about quantum mechanics all along. Let's pull it all together. We started with Schrödinger Equation, the equation of motion for the wave function playing the same role Newton's second law plays in classical mechanics. Then Bohr's rule, the absolute value squared of psi times dx, gives you the probability of finding the particle in that interval. Then collapse, measure the particle and the wave function snaps down into a spike, whatever the result you got. And finally, the probability toolkit, expectation values, variance, and probability density. The mathematics we'll be using for the rest of this course. Next time, we'll normalize the wave function and derive the time-independent Schrödinger equation, the tool that actually lets us solve real problems. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the lecture 2.